Today we're going to be taking a look inside of this Nissan VQ engine to see what's inside and how it works. And we're also going to take a look at what makes this engine so strong, durable, and popular that Nissan still uses this engine in production form today, almost 20 years after its release. Now the engine that I have here is the more popular VQ35DE engine. This one's out of a Nissan Murano. Now there was no major failure with this engine. It was leaking and burning some oil in typical Nissan fashion. Now we're also going to be taking apart this engine to see what some of the problem spots are on these engines if you're thinking of owning a vehicle with this motor. Now this being a VQ35, it means it's a 3.5 liter V6 engine, so you've got 3 cylinders on this side and another 3 cylinders on the other side. We have an aluminum block as well as aluminum heads, and it's all driven off of a timing chain setup at the front. But taking a general look across the top of the engine here, we do have these valve covers which are made of plastic. At the top here we have the lower intake plenum and the fuel rail. At the front here we have the timing cover which houses the timing chains. Now, the variable valve timing solenoid has already been removed from this engine, but it would sit right on the top here on this head here and one on the other head to control the intake side of the camshaft. Now looking at the cooling setup on the VQ35, we do have this bypass hose that goes from the front part over here and comes around to the back. We've also got the inlet and outlet hoses over here that go to the radiator. Now at the back here, joining the two heads together, we do have this metal pipe that runs from this head over to this head over here. And speaking of cooling, we do have the thermostat buried inside of this housing here, and the water pump is actually driven off of the timing chain underneath this cover. I'll start by removing this coolant bypass hose. Next we'll take a look at the fuel system on the VQ35DE. Now this one is a port injected engine, which means that you've only got injectors right at the top here that inject fuel into this lower intake plenum here just before it goes into the head. Now that's good because the port injected engine doesn't suffer from carbon buildup. It's fairly simple. You just have these 2 fuel rails with the 6 fuel injectors, 1 for each piston. And I'll go ahead and remove the fuel system. And just remove that, and you can see the injectors there. Now most VQs have a typical bowl shape that sits on top of here that forms the upper intake plenum to gather all the air. That air is then going to be sucked down into this lower intake plenum here, which splits it off into the individual cylinders. I'm just going to remove all the bolts here that hold the lower intake plenum on. Then I can lift off that lower intake plenum. Now with that lower intake plenum removed, you can see that there was basically a rat's nest trying to form inside of here. Just use my wife's old toothbrush to brush that out. Now just in between here we have the knock sensor, which is what the computer uses to retard timing in case the wrong fuel is used, and it senses engine knock. Now there's not much else I can take apart at the top here. I don't want to take off these valve covers because next we have to flip the engine upside down. Now all the mess down there is draining out. We can take a look at the bottom of this VQ engine. Now we do have this oil pan. Interestingly, it doesn't span the whole engine. It just spans basically half of the engine, and it is made of steel. At the front here we have the oil filter and the oil cooler. Now in some models, like the rear drive models, they actually stick out the side this way. And this engine also has an aluminum upper oil pan. Alright, we're going to start by first removing the oil pan bolts. And we can lift it off. This one doesn't have any milky residue, so there was no head gasket leak or anything. And I'll just remove that 19mm union bolt. And remove the oil filter here. And I'll remove the oil cooler. Now taking a look inside the lower oil pan, you can see we've got the oil pickup tube here. Now its screen doesn't look very clogged, so we know that there wasn't any major issues with debris in the engine. Further down below that we have the oil pump. Now if you're doing any sort of timing work on this engine that you have to remove the timing cover, you actually have to remove this lower oil pan to get to these 2 bolts here that hold that timing cover on. And I'll go ahead and remove the oil pickup tube and those 2 timing cover bolts. I'm also going to go ahead and remove all the bolts inside of here that secure this upper oil pan to the block. Just work my way around and remove all the bolts around the upper oil pan. And now I can remove the upper oil pan. Now with that oil baffle out of the way, we have clear access to the crankshaft, which you can see inside of here, and it's also got these counterbalance. It's a one-piece forged design, and reinforcing that is this ladder frame that's on top of here. Now this is the real reason why these VQ engines are so strong, is it's got this reinforced ladder frame that's going to help with any bearing movement or vibration or anything, especially at those higher loads and higher RPMs when you're really pushing this engine. Now having this built-up bottom end is also good for tuners if you do want to get a little bit more out of this engine by either adding some modifications or even boosting this engine. It can take a lot without rebuilding this bottom half. Now the real reason why I open the bottom end is to get this crank bolt loose. And I'll just undo that and pull off this crank pulley. Now I got access to the timing side of the engine. Now while I'm here, I'm also going to loosen up these bolts that hold the ladder frame together. These are E14 external Torx bolts. Once those have all been breaking free, I'm just going to zip them off with my impact. And then I can remove this reinforcing ladder frame. You can see it's just a one-piece cast aluminum design. Now with the bottom end removed, it's now time to flip the engine back over again. Ouch. Make a mess. Okay, this is a lot bigger mess than I thought. I'm just going to use my brother's old shirt here to sap up this mess. I got a piece of my wife's old top here. Use that. There's my old hoodie. Oh well. Alright, rule number one when working on engines is to drain the fluids, even though they said they've drained the fluids. I think there was still all the oil left in here. Now with the bottom half removed, we're then going to turn our attention to the side here, which has the timing cover. I'm going to release all of these 10mm bolts so we can have a look at the timing chain setup. Now over here we have the bracket for the engine mount. Now in front wheel drive models, this is a loaded engine mount here which bolts to the side of the frame rail. Now in rear wheel drive model, this engine sits longitudinally, so this mount doesn't really do much. I'll just remove these 17mm bolts and remove that bracket. I'll just remove the housing for the thermostat here. See, this is where the thermostat's located, right near where the water pump is inside of here. Now one good thing, or perhaps it's a trick, is that the VQ35s have these axis covers for the camshafts at the top here and the timing chain tensioner and water pump, so you can actually service them without removing this whole cover. The caveat here is that on front wheel drive models, it's right up against the frame rail over here, so you really have no room to access these water pumps and camshafts and the timing chain tensioner. You gotta remove a lot of stuff and it's going to be a really tight job. Pry the tensioner cover off here, pry off the water pump cover here, and the camshaft cover at the top here. Alright, and with all those covers removed, I can now remove the timing chain cover here. Now here we've got a good look at the timing chain setup on the VQ35. At the bottom here we've got the oil pump that is directly powered by the crankshaft. The chain is then going to come up here through this plastic guide over here to power both intake camshafts. Now, as you can see, these are both variable valve timed, so these are their actuators inside of here. I've got a link in the description on how these work, so make sure you check that out. Now the timing chain then cuts across here with another plastic guide and comes around over here to power the water pump. That's right, that means the water pump is actually internal inside of the engine as opposed to an accessory outside the engine powered by the belt like many other vehicles. That also means if your water pump does in fact leak, these don't really have that tendency though, your coolant's going to mix with the oil and bad things could happen. Now across the top here we have these secondary chains here that power the exhaust camshafts on either side. Now on the VQ35DE regular engines, the exhaust camshaft is just a fixed gear. On the rev up versions, there's actually variable valve timing on the exhaust side as well. And as I rotate the engine, you can have a look at how those timing chains rotate along with the cam and crankshaft. Now the water pump's just held on by a couple of 10mm bolts, and I'm going to blast off. Now of course, before I release the water pump, I have to release this chain tension, and that's done over here at the chain tensioner. Now the tensioner on the VQ35s are a pretty weak spot on these engines. They have a strong tendency to fail. Now they are hydraulically actuated, so there is an oil galley in here that tries to keep the chain tension. When they do fail though, the tension is going to become very slack on this chain here, and that's going to cause the cam and crank to slip out of timing, causing damage to the engine. The biggest characteristic of a failed timing chain tensioner is a rattle coming from the timing chain area. That's just the chain jumping around, especially when you start it up on a cold morning. Just how that snapped back, and there's your tensioner. Now this one still's got a bit of spring to it, so it hasn't failed just as yet. You can see that with no tension on this chain anymore, this crank is just going to start skipping and spinning until you eventually get engine damage. Alright, with the chain out of tension completely, then I can pull up this water pump. I forgot to knock these bolts loose when the chain was tensioned, but we'll try it. I'm also going to release the exhaust bolts here. I'm going to remove this guide here, and then I can remove the main timing chain. And I'm just going to wriggle this intake gear off here. There we go. Now in order to keep the secondary timing chain tension, we do have another hydraulic tensioner, one on this side over here and one over here on the other bank, and that keeps that chain nice and tensioned. Next I'm going to start removing all of the bolts that hold the oil pump on at the bottom here, and then I can remove the oil pump here. Now there's a number of 10 and 12mm bolts that hold this timing cover to the engine, and it's mandatory that you remove this timing cover in order to get the heads off of this, which makes it kind of time consuming if you have to do like a head gasket job. Alright, here we go. Now in order to remove this tensioner, I have to remove this hex bolt at the bottom here, and then I can get this tensioner slide out. Sometimes these do wear out because they're made of plastic, and sometimes they actually disintegrate, which is pretty bad for the engine. Now, removing the timing cover on one of these is sometimes a chore. You gotta really pry it back and forth in different spots in order to wiggle it free. And there we go. Now, the real reason why this timing cover is held on by so many bolts is because it's actually part of the oil lubrication system. This galley inside of here and inside of here carries oil to critical components such as the hydraulic tensioner over here, as well as feeds the oil from the main galley down at the bottom to the heads that go up inside of here for the variable valve timing system. Now, if you spin it over at the back here, you can see where the main galley goes into the timing cover, and it would come out over here and here to feed the heads. Now, instead of these galleys being machined out, they're actually a track that they just put this cover on top of. Now, there is a gasket that goes in between them, and on later versions of this engine, these do develop a leak, which would cause your oil pressure to drop and not reach the heads. Now, of course, doing an oil galley gasket job here is going to be quite as involved as removing all of these components in order to get to them. But take a look at the secondary chain tensioner. It's buried way inside of there, so if it does in fact fail, you have to remove the timing cover, you have to remove the valve cover and the top half of this head part here in order to access the bolts to change that out. Now we're going to turn our focus to the cylinder heads on the VQ35. Now, the valve covers are made of a plastic-like material and are held on by a bunch of 10mm bolts that I'm going to remove next. Pry up this valve cover and just pop that off. Now, the disadvantage to having a plastic valve cover is that the heat could cause it to warp over time, causing a leak, and that's kind of what happened here. Once these valve cover gaskets kind of give out and the plastic warps, there's no way you're going to get it to seal back properly, and then you either end up with oil in the spark plug or oil dripping down the side of the engine. Now, you can replace these gaskets, however, Nissan did make an updated version of these valve covers in newer DE engines. Now, this top part here is what houses the variable valve timing actuator and sends oil over to the VVT gear that sits over here. Now, this is just held on by a couple of 10mm bolts that I can pop off, and that releases the camshafts. Now, take a look at this side of the engine here, which would be the front side in the Murano. You can see just how coated the valve cover and everything below it is in oil due to this valve cover seepage. It's just dropping oil all over the block and down to the bottom. Let's pop off this side valve cover to see just what happened. We'll just lift this cover up here, pull it off. Surprisingly, the engine looks pretty clean. Now, the back of the engine, we have the camshaft sensors. Now, this was another weak point on early VQ engines, that these camshaft sensors would go in to throw a check engine light. Luckily, they are fairly easy to replace, unless if you've got a rear-wheel drive model and it's way back against the firewall. Now, the VQ engines use a very simple valve train setup with a double overhead cam design. You've got the intake camshaft on this side and the exhaust camshaft on this side. There's no rocker arm system, basically a camshaft that goes directly on top of the bucket that powers the valve up and down. This makes it a lot more simple because you don't have to do valve adjustments, and you also don't have to deal with extra mass moving around, especially at higher RPM. Of course, having a double overhead cam design means that you can do different things like have variable valve timing or lift on one or the other, which Nissan has done in later versions of the VQ engine. Whereas a Honda engine has a single overhead cam, so you can't really do too much with that. Now, the camshafts right up inside of this housing over here, which has these holes that go to the oil galleys inside, and it's also got 3 other camshaft caps. I'm going to go ahead and remove all the bolts holding the camshaft caps on. And with those caps removed, I can then pop off these camshafts. And you can see the condition of the bearing surface is okay. It does have a little bit of wear and scoring, probably from heating up without any oil. Now it's time to remove these head bolts. I'm using a 10mm hex over here. Alright, with all those broken free, I'm just going to zip them loose with my impact. And now I'm going to break free this head. Just lift it off of the dowels here. And to lift off the head on this side. Sometimes these knock sensoring wiring harnesses can get crispy and break just due to the heat cycling. And then you got to replace this side of the harness. Now, with the heads removed, we have clear access to the head gasket. So you imagine if you have to do a head gasket job, you pretty much have to tear down most of the engine. It's probably best done when you removed it from the vehicle. Now, VQ engines aren't typically known for blowing head gaskets. We'll leave that to the Subarus. And the head gaskets in these engines are made of a multi-layer steel. Now, taking a look at the condition of the top of these cylinders here, you can see that they're really dark and really full of sludge and soot. And you could definitely tell that this engine's been burning some oil. It either could be due to the piston rings allowing oil to enter the combustion chamber, or just leaky valve seals allowing oil to drop right in. I'm going to flip this block over once more. Hopefully there's no more oil that's going to drop out. Now, looking at the bottom of this engine here, we have the connecting rod caps here that bolt up to the connecting rods at the bottom. Now, these use a 10mm 12-point socket, so I'm just going to put my breaker bar on there and release the tension. And once I've broken those free, I'm going to zip them off with my impact. Then I'll remove that connecting rod cap. You can see the bearings are okay. They do look a little bit darker in color. So you can kind of tell that whatever coating was on them from before is definitely worn off. So maybe this engine ran out of oil for a short period of time. Release the piston from underneath, and you can see what that looks like. Now taking a look at the VQ35DE's piston, you'll notice that it is actually an over square design. That means that the piston bore is actually a little bit longer than the stroke. Now you can see the condition of these pistons are pretty rough. There's a lot of oil buildup on the piston top itself, and the oil control rings here are completely clogged up, as are the return ports on the inside here, which means that the oil has nowhere else to go except into the combustion chamber to get burned. I've got another video on why engines do burn oil, and you can link that in the description below. Now I've got another detailed video on why engines do burn oil, and I've linked that in the description below, but you can definitely tell that this VQ was an oil burner. Alright, so with all the pistons removed, we can now remove this rear main seal here, and then I can go ahead and remove the bearing cap. I kind of noticed some very light scoring, so I can bet that the oil light was on at some point in this vehicle. These bearing caps are no joke. They're actually pretty hefty and made of steel. Now the condition of the crankshaft isn't terrible. We do have some overheating in this region over here, as well as some scoring on this bearing surface here. And now I'm going to remove the crankshaft from the block. And once again, I notice there's some slight burning on this bearing over here. And finally, with the block all stripped out, I'm going to remove it from the engine stand. So now that the engine is torn down, we're going to have a closer look inside some of these components to see how it works. Now we're going to take a look at the oil lubrication system on the VQ35. Now I've got an in-depth video on how the lubrication system works on this engine, so you can check that out in the description below. But we all know that a good engine must have a good lubrication system in order to keep critical components well lubricated. Now we're going to start here at the oil pickup tube, where it draws engine oil in, pumps it, and sends it through the upper oil pan to get filtered out, and then back up through this hole to the main block. On this side here, you can see a hole that brings return oil down from the head. Now looking at the block, the oil is then going to come down through here and then across through the timing chain cover to bring oil down through the middle galley right down the center of the block. That main galley is then going to lubricate these main bearings on the crankshaft, as well as these sprayers for the cylinder liner. Now at the top of the block here, you have these two holes that tee off of that main galley to lubricate the head. Now here's a look at the timing cover. You can see this one here takes the oil to the main galley, and then we've got this other one here that tees off of it and feeds both variable valve timing gears. Now because the timing chain is so integral to the lubrication system on the VQ engines, if there's any leak in between the engine block or the heads, you can lose oil pressure and thus lubrication to something. Now taking a look at the head itself, you'll see that there's this hole in the camshaft here that feeds oil from the head right through this hollow camshaft, so it lubricates each one of these bearings. Of course, if your oil pressure runs too low or you run the engine too low on oil, oil is not going to reach these upper bearings here, and you're going to start to see some scoring like what you can see here. Now the VQ's head bolts are just a standard torque to yield type of bolt. I like how it uses a standard 10mm hex bolt and not some special tool. Now looking at the engine head, we have a hydraulic tensioner here that's going to tension the chain that runs in between these two camshafts. Now it's going to get its oil from this housing over here. Now this also houses the variable valve timing solenoid that sits on top of it and feeds oil to the variable valve timing gear. So you can see just how integral these are to the lubrication system in the upper half of the engine. And now looking under the engine head, it kind of looks like the tops of the pistons, where it's really black and has a lot of carbon buildup. Now this is either due to the valve stem seals themselves leaking oil from the head down into the combustion chamber, or more than likely the piston rings that are clogged up, just allowing oil to sit inside the combustion chamber and get burned. Now if you don't keep an eye on your oil levels, or like in the case of this Murano owner, you don't care about your valve cover gasket leak, your entire engine head, as you can see here, is going to be completely coated in oil, and it's going to be really difficult to clean this up, especially when the engine is in the vehicle. The best you can do is at least take care of the valve cover gasket leak so that your oil system remains fully enclosed. Now the VQ engines don't use a rocker system. Instead they have these direct buckets that act right on the camshaft themselves. Now of course you can do a valve adjustment on these. Each one of these does have a number on it, and they just pop directly on. Let's take a quick look at the VQ's cooling system, because cooling is almost as important as lubrication. Starting here at the thermostat housing, where the upper radiator hose comes inside of here, it'll then feed coolant down directly into the cylinder head. That's just through these water jackets that you see inside of here. Now these water jackets here are going to share that coolant with the engine block because it's an open deck design. Now once the coolant's done cooling off that head, we then have this port at the back here that'll bring coolant over to the other head to do exactly the same. Now the VQ35 has an open deck design, which means that there is no reinforcement in these coolant jackets. It's just a hollowed out coolant jacket that runs about half the depth of the piston stroke here, and that's going to allow the combustion chamber to cool down. Now once that coolant's done, it's then going to be pumped out through the water pump here. It's got a passageway on this side and one on this side here that's going to suck coolant out from both sides of this V6 engine and then back out to the radiator to get cycled. Now perhaps the water pump is one of the worst things when it comes to the VQ engine because of its location. It's located inside of the timing chain cover, powered by the timing chain itself, so if you ever do need to replace it, the problem is really where it's located inside of this cover. You do have an access panel to get to it over here, and you do have to remove the timing chain tensioner to slack the tension off the chain in order to get this out. We also have to remove everything on the front half of the engine. And on a front wheel drive transverse model like the Murano in this case, you got to remove engine mounts and a lot of accessories just to get to it. Now with all the talk of the VQ35DE engine, Nissan did make a lot of revisions to this engine, but only on its rear wheel drive model. VQ35DE is still used in front wheel drive models today, such as the Murano, the Quest, the Pathfinder, and the Maxima. Most notably was the VQ35HR engine, which stood for high revs. It was a built-up version of this engine that was used in the G35, M35, and FX35, basically strengthening up this ladder frame and the bottom end to take higher revs. And it also made use of a bigger intake with 2 throttle bodies feeding this air intake plenum. Combine that with variable valve timing on both the intake and the exhaust side, as well as a better exhaust setup, and the VQ35 had a much flatter torque curve and upwards of 300 horsepower from a naturally aspirated 3.5 liter V6 engine, which is renowned at the time in the mid-2000s. Now further to that, the VQ37HR, which is a 3.7 liter model of the VQ engine, came with a variable valve timing and lift control, basically a higher cam profile, just similar to VTEC, to make up to about 350 horsepower from the factory. And from all this, you can definitely tell that Nissan put a lot of thought and resources into developing this engine, especially considering that it was well ahead of its time when it debuted almost 20 years ago on the 2002 Nissan Maxima. And if you consider its rivals at that time, the MZ series of engines from Toyota and the J series of engines from Honda, both of those were timing belt driven, which means that you'd have that service come up every 100,000 miles or so. You also had a dual overhead cam design here instead of a rocker driven single overhead cam design that Honda still uses today. And this engine did have dual variable valve timing in some configurations, something that the competition took a little while to catch up on in the 2000s. Now what really makes the VQ series of engines attractive to tuners is the fact that it's really lightweight and compact, which is good to build a race car from. There are a dime a dozen nowadays because many Nissan vehicles use them, and the fact that the aftermarket has a lot of good support with bolt-on accessories to build this engine up and make it really fast. Now with all that being said though, the biggest drawback of the VQ series of engines is its thirst for engine oil. Whether it burns it or it leaks it, you really got to keep these engines full and topped up with oil and keep an eye on the oil level, otherwise it's pretty easy to throw a connecting rod bearing. Sadly though, some of the main enemies of the VQ35 isn't the engine itself, but the poor transmissions that Nissan chose to attach to them. Some of the automatics and especially the CVTs are known to blow out, which doesn't bode well for the owners who really want to maintain and keep their cars long term. And with that, we can see why the Nissan VQ engine is definitely an award-winning engine. Sadly though, I think it's going to be replaced slowly by the variable compression 4-cylinder turbocharged engine you see in the new QX50 and Nissan Altima, although the V6s do have their place in Nissan's truck lineup. Now make sure you follow me on Instagram for more behind the scenes footage and subscribe for more videos just like this one.